With well over 1,000 episodes, Monday Night Raw has had a lot of great moments. But if I had to pick just one episode as my absolute favorite, well, it would be hard to do. There is definitely one that stands out the most. Now, it's been over 20 years since it aired, and having just rewatched it, the episode does take me back and reminds me of what exactly I loved about the Attitude Era and wrestling in general, which is all the more reason why it's the topic of this episode. Because today, Dave knows Monday Night Raw, The Dark Wedding. Allow me to start by saying that it isn't a hard and fast favorite of mine, as there are plenty of other episodes that do come rather close. But when this episode aired, I declared it the very best in Monday Night Raw history, and so far nothing has definitively dethroned it, at least not for me. So why don't we just get into it? Taking place on April 26, 1999, right in the heart of the Attitude Era, this was the peak of what WWF had to offer at the time. Stone Cold Steve Austin was WWF champion, it aired fresh off of a WWF pay-per-view, they were plugging this newfangled show called SmackDown, Jim Cornette made a rare appearance on Raw commentary, and it was jam-packed with action, excitement, and entertainment. Also, what's really surprising about this episode taking my own personal #1 spot is that it contains a lot of elements that I personally don't really care for, such as a wedding, Stephanie McMahon taking the spotlight, and Vince Russo being heavily involved with the creative aspect of the show, among other things. However, despite all that, I have to admit that the use of each one of these was done brilliantly, so much so that they were a welcome part of making this particular episode just as great as it was. Now sure, this episode was by no means flawless, as there were plenty of things I could have done without, such as the beaver cleavage segment, the PMS meet backstage vignette, and the matches themselves weren't necessarily top shelf. But instead, let's focus on what the episode did right. And speaking of the matches, I would really like to start by pointing out that while they may not have been very long or very heavy in chain wrestling, at least the matches were plentiful. Because this episode contained 7 matches, even though one of them never officially got underway and the main event did end in a no contest. Although this is not counting a quick backstage brawl between Al Snow and Hardcore Holly. But what's really interesting about the number 7 is that back then Raw was only 2 hours, or technically 1 hour was Raw and the other hour was the War Zone for all you sticklers out there. However, if we flash forward 2 decades later to the April 22nd, 2019 episode of Raw, which was 3 hours long, we'll find that it also had 7 matches. Granted, those matches were a lot longer, although I don't necessarily know that that was a good thing, because when it comes to wrestling, sometimes better isn't always better, at least in the grand scheme of things. I know that sounds really weird, but let's look at it this way. Comparing the cards for both shows, I would have to say that Triple H versus Billy Gunn was probably the best match on the card of the 1999 episode. Meanwhile, in 2019, AJ Styles versus Samoa Joe versus Rey Mysterio for the #1 contendership, as well as Robert Roode versus Ricochet, and the very underrated Cesaro versus Cedric Alexander matches were all easily superior. And I would easily choose to rewatch any of those matches over any of the ones that happened on the April 26, 1999 episode. However, even though the matches weren't as good, I have to say this is a perfect example of something that wrestling did right back then. Giving quick serviceable matches on weekly television was just a great way to keep fans' appetites whet. Meanwhile, saving the really big performances for the pay-per-view, and really big performances for the main event of the biggest pay-per-view of the year. Back then, booking understood where wrestling matches fit in the grand scheme of things, and these kind of matches kept fans engaged, but not overspent, still leaving plenty of reasons to want to buy a monthly wrestling supercard event. And it also kept wrestlers from getting injured all the time, since they weren't pulling out all the stops. Although they were still taking chair shots to the head at the time, so I guess you can't have everything. Anyway, another upgrade for this episode and these matches was storytelling. Now in this particular example, I'm more talking about having a story through line in the narrative rather than having in-ring storytelling, although these matches did have that too. What I'm really talking about is that we saw these matches interwoven throughout the night as part of an overall episode. There was a very clear cause and effect laid out. For example, let's break down the show. The first match of the night featured X-Pac and Kane, the WWF Tag Team Champions, going against the Brood. After the match, the Brood snuck attacked Kane and hit him with a bloodbath. But then when the lights went back on, the Brood had left and Kane only saw X-Pac, and so he decided to attack him. As the night went on, X-Pac was looking for Kane in order to clear the air between the two of them. Then the Undertaker called Vince McMahon, demanding control of the World Wrestling Federation, and he also demanded that Vince McMahon get Stone Cold Steve Austin to be the one to hand over the paperwork. Meanwhile, D'Lo Brown had a match against Val Venus where Nicole Bass came down to try and seduce the Big Val Boski. This was followed by the aforementioned Triple H Billy Gunn match where Billy was looking to get revenge on Triple H for deserting DX. After this, we saw Mankind and The Big Show, who had just become allies after going against each other just the night before at WWF In Your House Backlash in a boiler room brawl, taking on the corporate team of the Big Boss Man and Test. And after Test and the Boss Man lost, the two would square off, with Test being kicked out of the corporate faction. And then the Godfather had a non-title match scheduled against Jeff Jarrett. However, Double J pointed out that as a former two-time IC champ himself, the title should definitely be on the line. Godfather agreed to put the belt up, but only if Jarrett put Deborah on the line as well, where if Jarrett lost, Deborah would become one of the Godfather's employees, to which Jarrett agreed. And now the stage was set, because this is where everything starts coming together. During this match, Val Venus returned to try and seduce Deborah, only for Nicole Bass to return as well to scare off the big Val Boski. This distracted Double J, who then lost the match. But before the retaining champion could collect his prize, Owen Hart came down to rescue Deborah. Then Ken Shamrock and Bradshaw were scheduled to have a match, but before the bell could ring, it turned into a brawl with both acolytes attacking Shamrock. However, Test would come down to make the save, trying to make a new alliance since he was now kicked out of the corporation. Then towards the end of the show, X-Pac called Kane out to the ring in order to try and hash out their misunderstanding. However, this brought out both Jeff Jarrett and Owen Hart instead, because after Jarrett failed to capture the Intercontinental title earlier in the night, him and his partner Owen shifted their focus to now trying to capture tag team gold instead. However, this brought Kane out to save his partner, even though Kane would just end up attacking X-Pac himself immediately afterwards, only to then pick him up and carry him off stage, leaving us on a cliffhanger for next week as we could only try to guess what the Big Red Machine's motivations were. So now you can see the cause and effect here. The events of one match would spill over into another as they all intersected with one another. This is how you make intrigue and interest in matches without having titles on the line. This is how you tell stories, and this is how you keep audiences invested. And as much as it pains me to say, I do have to admit that this is one thing that Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara did very well, at least during this very specific period of time and under the watchful eye of Vince McMahon. And I will also admit that this style of episode construction is something that I think WWE sorely needs right now. But so far, this is all without mentioning the two biggest storylines of the episode. The first came right after the opening title sequence as The Rock walked down to the ring addressing the crowd after failing to regain the WWF World Heavyweight Championship after his WrestleMania rematch against Stone Cold Steve Austin the night before. This led to the Great One calling out Shane McMahon, who was a special guest referee for the match, and this resulted in The Rock being fired from the corporation, getting beat down by his former colleagues, and turning babyface. And when The Rock finally got back to his feet, he would challenge Shane McMahon to a match later on in the night, to which Shane surprisingly accepted, which became the main event of the show. Now this match was nothing special, as it just ended in a big schmoz. But the major angle which was teased throughout the entire show was the kidnapping of Stephanie McMahon. The previous night's pay-per-view ended with The Undertaker abducting Stephanie, and this episode of Raw started with Vince McMahon worrying and willing to comply to anything that The Undertaker wanted in order to get his daughter back. And what really made this fascinating is that we got to see the normally ruthless and cold-hearted Vince McMahon now being uncharacteristically scared and vulnerable. And as the night went on, Vince began doubting if he would ever see his own daughter again. In his desperation, he turned to, of all people for help, his greatest archenemy, Stone Cold Steve Austin. However, he was denied. Austin's thinking was that after everything that McMahon had put him through, why on earth would he ever help him? Firmly believing that this wasn't his problem and that Vince deserved everything that he has coming to him. Throughout the show, McMahon was growing more and more fearful as the night drew to a close, with The Undertaker set to finally make his appearance at the end of the program. Meanwhile, backstage, even The Big Show mentioned to Austin that, hey, it's the guy's daughter, to which Austin replied that he didn't give a rat's ass who it was, and he continued about his way. Then finally, at the end of the show, we saw The Undertaker and his Ministry of Darkness dragging a helpless, pleading Stephanie McMahon down to the ring, revealing that they were about to conduct a dark wedding ceremony, forcibly making Stephanie McMahon The Undertaker's unwilling bride. But then, coming to her rescue was Ken Shamrock, who was easily dispatched by the Ministry. However, The Big Show then came out next to try and stop The Undertaker, but also to no avail. Things looked completely hopeless as the ceremony was almost complete. But then, the sound of glass shattering hit and Stone Cold Steve Austin ran down to the ring, clearing house and releasing Stephanie McMahon from the clutches of The Undertaker. A grateful Stephanie hugged Austin, who, in character, refused to hug her back. The show came to a close with Vince finally reunited with his daughter and Stone Cold Steve Austin looking on after coming to the aid of his greatest foe simply because it was the right thing to do. This was an absolutely fantastic episode, with several storylines going on simultaneously throughout the night, capping off with the conclusion to the tale of a reluctant hero helping his archenemy, rescuing the girl, and saving the day. It was a classic good versus bad story with character arcs, motivations all being well executed. It was storytelling, it was entertainment, It was Monday Night Raw. But what is your favorite episode of Monday Night Raw? Let me know down in the comments. And please help keep this channel going, just like Jesus Farrow, Richard Lee, and Wesley Landon Woosley, aka Mr. Woos, who has an awesome Wrestling E Federation that you definitely should check out. And if you want a shout out, then go over to my Patreon page and become a supporter yourself. Thanks so much for the support, guys, and as always, Dave knows.